Welcome to Part 4 of our tutorial series on using the Environment Editor in CRYENGINE 5. In this episode, I'll be covering two categories of post-production effects, HDR and filters. And I'll be using CRYENGINE 5.6.6. You can also find written versions of these Environment Editor tutorials in our documentation right here. In the simplest possible terms, HDR is the technique of adapting the tonal range of a scene so you can actually see it. If I told you to go outside on a sunny day, stand in one place, and take a good look around, you'd probably feel pretty confident that you had a reliable and accurate image of what you'd seen, like a camera taking a photograph. And you'd be absolutely wrong. Actually, if you did take a picture of what you'd been looking at, the camera would give you some clues about why your confidence is misplaced. The camera would show you something like what you're seeing in this little game engine scene. There are parts that just seem too bright and other parts that are definitely way too dark. The thing is, there isn't anything you could do to see it this way because human vision is strictly automatic. Autofocus, auto-white balance, and most importantly, auto-exposure. Your eyes constantly move. Everywhere you look, your eyes adjust for exposure. Here's a real view from a camera set up very much the way your eyes work, namely on automatic. When I hold it still, you can see that the sunny areas are bright and the shadow areas are dark, which shouldn't be too surprising. What is surprising is that when your eyes or my camera point directly at the bright areas, the image gets darker. When you look at those shadowy areas, the image gets lighter. Your eyes only know how to do one thing: make everything look normal. There's another quirk to human vision. You can only see sharp detail in a field of view of about 1 to 2 degrees. You can't look at this shadow or this highlight without moving your eyes. You can stare straight ahead and sort of notice what's off to the sides, but it feels very vague and weird because you can't see anything clearly without looking straight at it. And since your eye's exposure is largely determined by what's in the middle of your field of view, the two are linked together, you can only ever see a normalized view of whatever you're looking straight at. The truly weird part is how your brain tricks you into thinking that you're seeing an entire scene all at once, when in fact you just collect lots and lots of little snapshots that your brain tells you are a seamless image. It's even trickier because when I ask you to describe how this area looks, for example, you'll tell me it's shady and dark in there. But you're actually reporting what you know about that shady spot based on your experience of the world and by comparing it to the sunny areas. You're not describing how this part of the scene actually looked because when you looked straight at it, your eye brightened it to a normal exposure. It actually wasn't shady at all. So without getting into anything technical, that is exactly what HDR is. In fact, your eyes are effectively an HDR system. They have to be, because they have to be able to see over a huge range of luminance, from a sunny day on top of a mountain covered in snow to a forest lit only by starlight. But as well adapted as your eyes are to this huge range of light on Earth, they can't actually handle the range of contrast you'll find on a sunny day. They can't see comfortably into the darkest shadows and the brightest highlights at the same time, so they deal with it dynamically, adjusting exposure as you look around. Now, you may have heard the word gamut, which means the range of luminance that an imaging device can see or reproduce. So when we say something is out of gamut, that means that it's brighter or darker than the device can see or reproduce. And when something is out of gamut, all you get is pure white or pure black, which isn't very good for navigating in the real world or in a game. Now, what HDR does is take the lightest and darkest tones that are out of gamut and push them into the range that you can actually see or that your monitor can reproduce. It maps out of gamut tones into the gamut that your monitor can display in this case. Now, just to see why we need HDR in a game engine where everything is under our control, let me show you what our little game world looks like without it. I've disabled HDR, and I'm also not using any diffuse light, meaning no environment probes and no SVOG. Now, this is quite different from the real world because you always have a lot of diffuse light from the sky and bounce light from the sun during the day. So here's our sky, there's our light source, the sun, and as I take a look around, you can see things very clearly and everything looks pretty normal. But now I'm just going to move the camera to face the shadows. And now you see what you can never actually see in real life, which is that it's really dark in those shadows. Now, if we go into our old friend, the Game SDK hangar, or any building you happen to have, It is so dark in here that you've probably forgotten that you left your Blackhawk parked here and took the keys, which is bad because these guys hate parking tickets. So why are things so dark? Well, because our exposure isn't adjusting to the lighting conditions. It's fixed to make the sunny parts of the scene look normal, because I disabled HDR. If you look down at the ground in these places where the sun is coming through the windows, those look perfectly normal. This little cart looks the same as the one outside because they're receiving the same amount of sunlight. But the shadows are completely out of gamut. They're pure black. Now, you can't actually do this with your eyes because you can't stop your eyes from adjusting and normalizing everything. Of course, since we have control over the lighting in our game engine, there is a simple way around this. You can just put light components inside your buildings that are as bright as the sun. Voila! Problem solved. And doesn't it look great? Well, no. It looks ridiculous, because it's surprisingly hard to buy electric lights that are as bright as the sun. What I mean is that it looks wrong just because it doesn't look like the world you're used to. And as much as there are no rules in game design, this sense of Earth-based reality that's kind of burned into everybody's head when it comes to lighting is a tough thing to shake off. So we're going to set the brightness of our sun and our light components at similar levels to what we're used to seeing, and use HDR to deal with the wide range of exposures, just like your eyes do. So hopefully you now understand why HDR is needed, so let's see how to actually use the HDR features in the engine. First, before you even think of using HDR, you need to make sure that your HDR eye adaptation mode is set for compatibility with CRYENGINE 5, not CRYENGINE 3. We do that by setting the CVAR, R for rendering, _ HDR eye adaptation mode to 1 right here in the console. I highly recommend that you put this setting into the autoexec.cfg or .cry project file in your project folder for all of your CRYENGINE 5 projects. Otherwise, if this CVAR is set to the default value of 2, you will have no control over your HDR settings, you'll hate life, you'll blame me, and you'll probably kick your dog. Don't kick your dog. In essence, HDR deals with the extreme shadows and highlights. But with most things, we want to start with the general settings and work our way to the specific. So before we begin to tweak shadows and highlights, I'd recommend that you set the parameters that are going to affect your overall exposure first. And something that you may not realize about exposure is that color has a big effect on our perception of brightness. Our eyes are not equally sensitive to all colors. For example, we perceive blue as the darkest color, and we see yellow, which just happens to be the opposite of blue, as the brightest color. You can judge for yourself by looking at these two swatches. They are exactly the same brightness and saturation. The only reason one seems to be brighter than the other is because of the photoreceptors in your eyes. You should really get those things fixed. So I recommend setting your color balance and saturation settings here before you start messing with exposure settings. Saturation controls global color intensity. Set the saturation to 0 and you have a black and white image, or grayscale if you prefer. Let's say you wanted to create a night vision infrared look. Desaturate 100%, set the white balance to green, crank up the grain effect here in filters, voila. Or you can also crank saturation up to as high as 200% if you want to make a game that your 3-year-old kid will really love. Saturation's pretty straightforward, but here's a tip that you might not know about it. As things get darker and darker, human beings actually lose their color perception completely before they lose the ability to see tones. In the darkest situations, we actually see everything in shades of gray. But this is a very tricky thing to prove to yourself because your brain has this habit of overriding what you're actually seeing with what you already know about what you're seeing or what you expect to see, which turns out to be a bigger problem than just vision, but that's another story. This just implies that if realism is your goal, you can desaturate your night scenes a bit. You can also use a bit more blur and limited range in the depth of field settings and throw in a little grain. Not that we actually see grain, but we've come to associate it with night photography and cinematography. Now, just a warning, you're never going to simulate exactly how things look at the limits of our low-light perception because it has some other sort of strange quirks, but it's helpful to know how your eyes work when you are trying to simulate it. Then we have the color balance setting, which lets you apply a color tint to your image, or not. There are two important things about this setting. As I've mentioned in other tutorials, the default color balance setting is yellow, for no good reason at all. So if you don't want your game design to be yellowized in the last stage, just set the saturation to 0. Here's another little tip about how human visual perception works. I already told you that we lose color perception before we lose tonal perception. And at the threshold of darkness, when we're about to lose all color perception, blue is actually the last color we can see. For that reason, and because we perceive blue as darker than other colors, it's quite common to use a blue tint for night scenes. Or mega double blue if you're James Cameron, who just really, really likes blue. I'll be back, and I'll be blue. Double blue. Run! Anyway, you can also apply this in the opposite direction to create the feeling of a blindingly hot, sunny desert by setting your color balance to more saturated yellow. Because we perceive yellow to be brighter than other colors, this will automatically make the scene feel brighter than it actually is. Just compare this same scene with exactly the same settings, and all I'm going to do is change the hue and the color balance setting between blue and yellow. Terminator 2, Lawrence of Arabia. A more subtle fact is that even though this setting is called color balance, the brightness of it also has a big effect on the brightness of your whole scene, so be careful with that. Color balance will take you right down to the bottom of the Mariana Trench. I should say that if you're trying to create a dark scene, just using these settings like a big make everything dark knob is not the ideal way to do it. That's really best done through lighting, then using HDR to fine-tune the tonal range. Just be aware that if you max out the saturation of your color balance setting, you have literally replaced every color in your scene with one color. And if you're going to do that, you might as well just desaturate everything first because you will get a better tonal range. One last tip about saturation. Color moves the eye around the scene. It helps the eye separate objects by providing color contrast. What I mean is that the more you remove color contrast by desaturating, the more you're going to need to provide tonal contrast. They have a complementary relationship, like a seesaw. And if you crank up both, you risk exhausting the viewer's eye. It tends to be too much of a good thing. Is there too much of a good thing? Is there? Now that we have our color balance and general exposure set, we can start to look at the actual HDR settings. Because while this whole section is labeled HDR, color balance and saturation and bloom actually have nothing to do with it. EV auto-compensation affects the entire tonal range of your image, and it forms the basis for the more specific HDR settings that'll affect shadows and highlights. I would recommend leaving this at the default setting in most cases unless you want to create a really stylized look. Unlike color balance, you can use this to totally overexpose your image, which might be cool when Virtual Arnold finally detonates the nuclear bomb at the end of your pre-apocalypse game and Sarah Connor says, "Told you." I'm going to leave the rest of these values at the defaults for the moment. And now if we move around, we can see HDR doing what it's supposed to do. When we go into the dark hangar, things get brighter. If we turn around and look back outside, the bright light makes the exposure darker again. Now, how much the exposure gets shifted is mostly determined by the average brightness of everything in the frame. Or to say it in a more visual way, how much of the frame is dominated by darker light tones. As I move closer to the entrance, the bright tones outside dominate more and more of the frame and my exposure gets darker until eventually we're adjusted for the outdoors again. Same thing if I approach the hangar from the outside. From a distance, it's very dark in there. You kind of have to concentrate on just the hangar area. And also keep in mind that any fog you're using will create this illusion that there's some lightning, which is a lie. But as I get close enough that the dark interior dominates the frame, the exposure finally brightens to normalize it. Now you've probably noticed that this exposure adjustment doesn't happen instantly. We've set the default speed to take a couple of seconds just so it doesn't draw too much attention to itself. But you are totally free to set the speed to anything you like using this CVAR, R_HDR eye adaptation speed. The default is 2, and be aware that this is not time, but speed. Here's what it looks like at a setting of 5. A lot faster, but potentially drawing more attention to itself than you might want. Like all things, test and test some more, and when you have it the way you want, add the CVAR to your autoexec.cfg or .cry project file, because there is absolutely no control over it in the environment editor. Now, the two most important settings that determine how much exposure compensation you're going to get are EV Min and EV Max. If you have no idea what EV means, you might guess that this sets the minimum and maximum brightness of the scene, but that's not quite how it works. EV stands for exposure value. The EV scale was invented for photography, and it's essentially an indirect way of telling a camera how bright a scene is. Without getting into the technical details, EV tells your camera what combination of settings it can use to get a correct exposure for a scene of a specific brightness. All you need to know is, the higher the EV number, the brighter the scene. 10 is twice as bright as 9, which is twice as bright as 8, etc. In other words, it's a logarithmic scale. It's useful to have an idea what range of exposure values you actually find here on Earth. For example, on a bright sunny day, you'll get an EV of about 15. And EV 15 happens to be about 80,000 lux, and lux is the scale used here by our friend sun intensity. So you can plug that value into here if you want to stick to realistic Earth conditions. Inside a building with the lights on, EV values typically average around 6. At night under a full moon, you'll get -3, or under a quarter moon, -6. Okay, now we get to the key concepts. There's more than one way to think about this, but this is what I recommend. Essentially, EV Min tells the HDR system how dark it should expect your dark scenes to be. Now that's used to help decide how much exposure compensation HDR is going to make for those dark scenes. If I go inside our dark hangar and set my EV Min to -3, that tells HDR to expect really dark scenes like they were lit only by a moon. So you're going to see a lot of brightening, the kind of brightening you'd need to get a dark EV -3 scene to look normal. If I tell EV Min that my dark scenes are only +6, which again is average indoor lighting, HDR is going to do a lot less brightening. So you can probably guess that EV Max tells HDR how bright it should expect your bright scenes to be. So if I set EV Max to a really bright value of 18, you're going to get a lot of darkening, the kind of darkening you'd need to get a bright EV 18 scene to look normal, because that's what HDR does. It normalizes. It's an auto exposure tool. The key concept is this. If you set these values much different than the actual brightness of your scenes, it's going to overexpose or underexpose your scenes. If you set them accurately, it's going to normalize the scenes. But wait, you say, how do I even know what exposure values I have in my game? I'm glad you asked. By enabling R_HDR debug 1. That'll show you the average scene luminance expressed in 3 different commonly used units. You can watch the auto exposure system adjusting to the lighting conditions. And by the way, auto EC, as you can guess, means auto exposure compensation. Now, before we go any further with the HDR settings, we need to understand one key thing. As long as you have no diffuse light, your shadows will always be pitch black. And HDR won't do a damn thing about it, because the rendering algorithm says, no diffuse light, shadows must be black, period. And HDR will never override that. So HDR is not a substitute for diffuse light. By the way, if we had allowed it to brighten up those blacks, you would not be pleased. I'm going to use Photoshop to show you exactly how it would look because I can't force the engine to do it. Beautiful, isn't it? There was never any detail in those shadows, so lightening them up just makes that painfully obvious. I'm sure you've already realized that in the majority of cases, you will need diffuse light. So from this point forward, I'm going to enable SVOGI and some environment probes to provide diffuse light. And now we can give HDR a fighting chance rather than asking it to do the impossible in terms of these shadows. So once I understood how this kind of worked, I figured that the best workflow would be to light my levels using real-world values and then tell HDR to expect those real-world values. So you can look up the exposure values I've been talking about, as well as charts that convert EV to lux. So knowing that, if I set my sun intensity to 81,920 lux, I can be confident that I'm getting an EV of exactly 15, which are typical daylight conditions. And I can light my interiors to a typical EV6. And in terms of HDR, I thought, well, then I'll plug in these values that I've created. EV Min is 6, EV Max is 15, which is funny, because those happen to be very close to the default values, which are 4.5 and 17. So hold on a second. Let's just take a look around with these default HDR values. And as we move through the darkest and brightest parts of the scene, which doesn't even have any really dark areas, you'll see a problem. The exposure compensation is just too much. With EV Min set this low at 4.5, my dark scenes, like the inside of this helicopter, are getting brightened so much that my highlights are just blown out. And this makes perfect sense because I've told the engine that these scenes are darker than they really are. But there's a more fundamental point that you need to understand. Like your eyes, this auto-exposure HDR system has one simple goal, and that's to make all scenes look normally exposed. And while this approach works really well in the real world to let you see clearly with your eyes, normalizing everything on a screen to the same exposure is just the wrong goal. It's not the way you want to use HDR. Let me explain. When you stand indoors and look outdoors, it should look brighter than normal out there. That's what you physically experience with your own eyes, so that's what's going to feel authentic in your game. It's simply a matter of degree. Now, the same goes for trying to peer indoors when you're standing outside. It's going to look really dark in there unless you shield your eyes from all outdoor lighting. If you brighten dark areas so they're normally exposed, they're not dark anymore. Sounds self-evident, but one of the lighting principles everybody struggles with in the beginning is to embrace contrast, to let dark areas be dark and bright areas be bright. So rather than adjusting your EV min values so your interiors become as bright as the outside, try brightening them enough so your player can see, but not so they're no longer dark, and definitely not so much that the sunlight coming through the windows looks grossly overexposed. What we want to do is balance interiors with exteriors by bringing the ratio of luminance down to an acceptable but still dramatic range, given what's in the frame at any given moment. So I'm going to put my camera inside the hangar so I mostly see the shady interior, but I can also see sunlight on the floor and some sky outside. And even though a typical indoor exposure value is 6, I'm going to set my EV min quite a bit higher at 10.5. Essentially, I'm deliberately lying to the HDR system and telling it that the dark interiors are brighter than they really are. So in this case, it only adds enough brightening that would be needed for an EV 10.5 scene instead of the drastic brightening that would be needed by an EV 6 scene, which is what I have. Shh, don't tell. I'm tricking it in order to preserve some of the darkness of the scene and to avoid overexposing the parts that are lit by the sun. This all boils down to creative compromise. Now, it turns out that we humans have a more difficult time seeing subtle differences in dark scenes than we do in bright scenes. So while you could use the same trick and lie about the EV max value to force HDR to overexpose the scene a bit, like this, in most cases, you'll probably want to be truthful to create a normal exposure in your bright scenes. If you're setting the sun to realistic levels like 80,000 lux, not the crazy default value of 243,854, you're going to get an EV 15 outdoors, which is exactly where I'm going to set my EV max value. And now we have a normalized exposure. Let's take a look around. You'll still see exposure compensation as I move between dark and bright areas, but it's much more subtle. You might still need to let the brightest part of the sky blow out when you're indoors, definitely the sun itself, but that's perfectly all right. When it's a small part of your frame, it's not going to bother you. It's consistent with your physical experience. Now, of course, you can also use these settings in a deliberately unrealistic way as a stylistic choice. For example, when you crush the shadows to black so the player can't see clearly, it gets their attention. It's uncomfortable because you've taken away the control they're used to having, and because real-world experience has taught us that not seeing is dangerous. But it's a great way to build exciting games, as long as the player feels it's fair and can still navigate. I modeled the style of this level on a well-known side-scroller game whose aesthetic you may recognize. I love side-scrollers precisely because you, the game designer, have more control over what the player gets to see than in an open-world game. In essence, what makes something like this compelling is what you take away or withhold, the way in which you limit what the player can see. Specifically, I set HDR saturation to 0 to remove all color, use the grain filter, set the depth of field to be shallow and noticeably blurred in the background, and something that may surprise you, I disabled all lighting. There is no sunlight or skylight in this level, and there are no light components. The only reason you can see anything is that I put an emissive fog volume behind the player and foreground elements. That adds a distance cue, which simply means that the farther away entities are, the more they just become fog-colored, white in this case. But since there's no actual light in the level, remember that emissive fog volumes only illuminate themselves and nothing else, I don't even need textures on any entities in this level. I also made dramatic use of silhouettes in the foreground elements. When you're trying to design a fresh look, one thing that helps me is to go too far, to take dramatic steps away from realism rather than tiptoeing away. I find it easier to find what I'm looking for if I give myself permission to go over the top, then scale it back, rather than gradually moving away from what's familiar. So ultimately, this is a creative choice. I'm just here to help you understand how the tools work so you're empowered to realize that vision you have for your game. There's one key thing to understand about the HDR settings in the environment editor. They are strictly post-processing effects. The scene is already rendered into an image before HDR starts playing with it. HDR just brightens and darkens the image that's already there. It doesn't trigger the whole render pipeline all over again. And needless to say, it doesn't have access to tones that didn't make it into the final render. Also, if you set EV Min and EV Max to the same value, you will get no exposure adaptation whatsoever. Essentially, when you match them, the value you choose becomes another way to set a fixed exposure for the whole game. Now, while EV Min and Max perform pretty simple exposure compensation, you can fine-tune them through the rest of these tone mapping settings: film, curve, shoulder, midtones, and toe. The word curve is the key here, but unfortunately I can't really show you what's going on under the hood because there's no curve editor here in the environment editor, nor is there a histogram to show you the actual values in the engine. So I'm just going to grab a screen capture of our scene and open it in Photoshop, because it does provide the histogram and curve tool that will illustrate what's happening. I'm sure you've seen histograms where the horizontal scale are the tones from black on the left to white on the right, and the vertical scale represents how much of the image contains each of those tones. So back to our tone mapping settings in CRYENGINE. I'm sure you know what midtones are. Toe refers to shadow tones, and shoulder refers to highlights. In order to make sense of these, we need to look at a curve editor tool, which you can find in Photoshop under Image, Adjustments, Curves, or be smart and don't change this image layer directly, but go to the Layers menu and use a Curves adjustment layer that you can modify forever. Curves tend to scare people and drive them to eat too much popcorn, so let me save you the stomachache and demystify them for you. We don't see a curve yet. We see a straight line that only has 2 points: how black our blacks are, down here, and how white our whites are, up here. If I click on this black endpoint, you'll see that we have an input value of 0. That represents the pure black that was already in the image. And we currently have an output value of 0. Very simply, when input and output are the same, we have made no change to the tones. But if I move this point to the right, I'm taking the input values that were dark but not black, and I'm crushing them to pure black. If I lift the point straight up, I'm mapping pure blacks to gray, and I'm brightening all the shadows, in fact everything except the white point. 0 becomes 35 in this case. I no longer have any blacks. Same thing with the white endpoint. In an 8-bit image, 255 is the whitest white we have. If I drag the point straight down, I'm mapping what used to be pure white to gray. I no longer have whites. You'll notice I'm using the term mapping, specifically tone mapping, which simply means to take the tones we're given, our inputs, and move them around to different output values. If the line is at a perfect 45-degree angle across the whole range, input and output values are the same, and nothing gets changed. We still have a simple straight line, but before I start making more complex adjustments using a curve, let me show you the equivalent of what these moves are in the engine. The film curve whitepoint setting works very much like moving the white endpoint that I just showed you. You can bring your brightest highlights down a bit, or throw away highlight detail by clipping it to pure white. Unfortunately, this value isn't expressed in any real-world units, but it's quite easy to see what it does. I would just use it gently. I actually find this setting most useful in dark night scenes, and that's because our ability to distinguish between similar tones diminishes as we approach black. The darker it gets, the more everything just starts to look the same. So it's very useful to expand the tonal range of dark scenes, which you can do by shifting this film curve whitepoint to the left. Essentially, that's brightening everything, and I would only do this in dark scenes where I don't have anything close to white in the first place, because I'm pushing everything up brighter. And remember that you don't necessarily need an absolute white in every scene, especially in dark scenes. The only place you should absolutely always see a pure white is within the disk of the sun, when it's not too close to the horizon. The sun itself is so bright that if you shifted your exposure so you could actually see detail on its surface, everything around it would literally be black. In any case, one of the biggest challenges across every imaging discipline is to create night scenes that feel dark, but which have enough contrast to distinguish details and enough light so the player can navigate. I just can't give you a mathematical formula for success because it's more of a subjective aesthetic judgment than a mathematical one, and that only comes from studying how light behaves and training your eyes. If lighting is your job, hopefully you find that to be some fun homework. Okay, back to tone mapping. So far, you've just seen a simple exposure adjustment like this. But there's another more subtle option. HDR can slow down these bright tones as they race toward pure white by adding a point up here in the highlights and dragging it down, and voila, we finally have a curve. And if you look at the input versus output values for this point I added, you'll see that as we're approaching white, the input values are getting lowered. We're darkening those highlights a bit without touching the pure white. We can do the same thing in the shadows by adding another control point down here, brightening them up as we approach black. And what we've done with these two new points is simply reduce the contrast of the scene. You'll also notice that our curve kind of looks like an inverted S, which is a term you'll actually hear in the imaging business. If we were to drag these points in the opposite direction into a normal S shape, we would be adding contrast to the scene. Highlight and shadow details are accelerating towards pure white and pure black. These curve adjustments are ubiquitous in the imaging world: video, photography, games, science, you name it. At some point, this S-curve reminded someone of a lower leg, I guess, so the bottom part of the curve was dubbed the toe, and the top part the knee or the shoulder. Somebody should get their arms and legs straight. So this brings us back to our tone mapping settings in the environment editor, where you can fine-tune the highlight through the shoulder adjustment, the midtones here, and the shadows through the toe setting. In general, I'd suggest that you tread lightly here. I would be especially careful about making radical changes to the midtone setting. It's very rare that you would move it from the default. Last but not least, in the HDR settings, you'll notice this bloom effect around high contrast edges like these window frames, which is light spreading into the shadows when it breaks around the dark geometry edges. While this is a real phenomenon produced by looking at the world through lenses, including the lenses in your eyes, the default bloom value is pretty dramatic, so you might want to adjust. The filters are also post-processing effects, and they're pretty straightforward. Grain is noise that sort of digitally imitates physical film grain, or you also see grain in digital systems. You can't control the size or anything except the intensity. It does have some performance cost like all of these post-processing effects, so be aware. To see the effect of a photo filter color, you have to bring the photo filter density above 0. Photo filter color is like a much more subtle color tint effect than HDR color balance, both its effect on luminosity and on color. For instance, if I just choose a middle gray photo filter, all I'm doing effectively is desaturating everything a bit. And if you push the brightness way up or way down, you will clip your highlights or shadows in a very unpleasant way. Whereas the HDR color balance does a much more sophisticated job of maintaining tonal relationships. But you can certainly use this to add subtle color tints if you like. The only other thing I'd say is that while human vision is definitely the point of reference by which we judge realism in images, vision turns out to be a very tricky business. And while we all feel very sure of what we see, there are no files in our heads. No images have ever been fixed in our memory that contain measurable data. Our whole certainty about what we see is really just an elaborate illusion perpetuated by our brains. So don't be afraid to experiment and try crazy things that you've never seen. You might just create something fantastic. And that is it for this Environment Editor tutorial. Check out the rest of our Environment Editor tutorials and let us know what you think in the comments or on our social media channels. Ciao.